Doesn't it?
Yeah. So he's because he could go to YouTube flying now, so he could go there and be rather.
Oh, okay, yes. Yes. Thank you. I'm bouncing back. I don't want to. That might be. Yeah, thank you. Six. Welcome. This is the Ellensburg City Council meeting of March 4th, 2024. Our first order of business is a study session regarding a sleep center feasibility analysis report and presentation by Econ Northwest. Just a reminder, study sessions are for the city council to study, learn about something. We do not allow public comment during the study session. There is an item later on in the agenda that deals with the sleep center. It's a letter of agreement between Hope Source and the city, setting the parameters for what a lease agreement might look like. At that time, there will be public comment. So, Heidi, do you want to give us a little background before we?
Yes, thank you. Madam Mayor Pro Tem and council members, I'm Heidi Berenstern, the city manager. And I apologize for the voice. I will try to talk as much as I can here, as long as I can. I want to provide just a little bit of background and do an introduction. So this is an item that's been one of the council's strategic priorities for a couple of years. In the December 2021, through a joint study session with the city and county commissioners, the group decided to enact an ad hoc committee on homelessness. And that group has been meeting since January of 2022 periodically. And the goal was really to look comprehensively at the services and the gaps in services we had at our community when it came to addressing homelessness. And there have been a number of meetings in June 2022. There's another joint study session talking about the recommendations for a year-round overnight sleep center, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. And then in July, council approved a motion, as did the county commissioners that same month, to look toward developing a joint a joint sleep center in connection with the county. We've had a number of outreach pieces over the last couple of years. In March of 2023, we actually did an open house. At that point, we did not have a site. We were starting the process of working with the county to hire our team here from Echo Northwest to come up with some ideas about siting a sleep center and the costs for actually building a sleep center and what a sleep center really is, the different models out there as well. This presentation that you'll see tonight in a similar format was presented to the city's Affordable Housing Commission earlier this year, and also the county's Homelessness and Housing Commission earlier this year as well. The ad hoc committee would like to do an open house on this topic. And we were hoping to have a site selected before we did an open house to talk through what a sleep center is and to help inform the community about the sleep center in general as well. This presentation will also be given to the county commissioners at their meeting tomorrow morning. So with that, I know we have our folks from Echo Northwest, Cadence Petros and Mackenzie. I cannot remember Mackenzie's last name, and I'll let them take it away.
Thanks so much, Heidi. Hope you feel better soon. Mayor Pro Tem, City Council, my name is Cadence Petros. I'm a project director at Echo Northwest, and today with me is Mackenzie Visser, an associate also with Echo Northwest. Mackenzie was instrumental in the cost analysis, and so if y'all ask me some tough questions about the numbers, I might phone my friend Mackenzie to help provide more detail. Why don't you advance to the next slide, please? Before we jump into the body of the presentation and our analysis, I wanted to set a little bit of context first. So as you all know, the city of Ellensburg has had a cold weather shelter that's been operated by KVMA for the past 8 years, primarily from November through March, overnight hours, and it's been accessed through different churches and nonprofit organizations. And that system has worked all right, but there is some fatigue with the organizations that have been hosting. And because of the regulatory context that we'll talk about in a second, a permanent sleep shelter year-round has been part of the city and county's thought process for a while, as Heidi mentioned. And that regulatory framework is Boise v. Martin and some associated additional court cases that are operative in the Ninth Circuit right now, which essentially prohibits cities and jurisdictions from enforcing anti-camping regulations if there aren't sufficient shelter beds for folks to go to. Essentially, you can't kick people out if you don't have places for them to go. And because many jurisdictions are very much interested in enforcing those camping regulations, many have taken it upon themselves to offer shelter beds as an alternative. And in the last couple of months, last month, Ellensburg has also, as you know, adopted a modification to the City Land Development Code to comply with House Bill 1220 to specify where emergency shelters might be located. Next slide, please. So our analysis focused on 3 topic areas. Where might you locate a year-round sleep center? And what were the criteria that you might use to identify a location? Then we also looked at, if you were able to locate a site, what would be the way in which you would want to operate it? And what would those components be? And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, once you figure out where and how you would want to operate it, what would it cost both to establish a sleep center? What are the capital costs to do that? And then what are the ongoing operating costs? And those are the 3 things that we'll be talking about today. So starting with site analysis. Where would you potentially put a sleep shelter? And this is, as you can imagine, a complicated endeavor to find an appropriate site. For many, many months, the city, before we were hired, looked at where might a sleep center be located. And then as we came on board, we identified some additional criteria to keep in mind, including zoning, site size. It needs to be kind of a Goldilocks size, not too large and definitely not too small to serve the number of folks that they were interested in serving. Be mindful of the adjacent uses. Is it accessible to transit and other services? And then, of course, is it available either for lease or to own? I probably should have mentioned that at the top because it doesn't do any good if you find the perfect site and it is not available for you to use. So we went through an evaluation of properties on CoStar, of kind of commercial leasing and sale opportunities, as well as looking at vacant lands just to see, even if they weren't currently on the market, what might come available. And initially, that brought up a list of potential options. We studied a couple, and then after further discussions, the city identified a third after conversations with Hope Source. And that property turned out to be the one that city staff are recommending. It's the Pathways property, and it's the area behind the former Knights Inn Motel. It is accessible to transit. It's the right size, has proper zoning. It has access to utilities, all things that make it amenable to a year-round sleep center. Next slide, please. So then through a series of discussions with stakeholders, including city folks, ad hoc committee on homelessness, county folks, as well as Hope Source, we really tried to understand how it was that if you were able to operate a year-round shelter, how you would want to go about doing that. And so here are some of the high-level components. They want year-round opening from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. And so it's not a tiny village, which is like permanent housing for the folks to access day and night, all day long. Essentially, they're new, small, permanent housing. Instead, it's an overnight shelter for people to come in out of the elements and have a safe place to go. The site would need to accommodate up to 25 individual use shelters because of the elements in Ellensburg with heating and cooling to assure that it was viable shelter. And then there needs to be some administrative capacity. So staff office, obviously, bathroom and showers, and then some places for community gathering for meals and potentially for services. And so those are the must-haves. And then ideally, right, being able to provide dinner, maybe a sack breakfast before they leave, storage for belongings, and then an opportunity to provide social services. One of the key tenets was really about how do we help people move from experiencing homelessness into permanent housing, and when they are located in a single location night after night, you're able to begin to develop relationships and provide linkages to other services so that they are able to access jobs, healthcare, mental health care, and then also permanent housing. And then, yep, that's fine. It's okay. Next slide. So when jurisdictions are considering different types of shelters, there are essentially a couple different methods. One that we'll talk about in more depth is called pallet shelters. And these are essentially a Washington-based company that developed small individual shelters that are built for the purpose of housing humans. They come with all the things if you want, including bedding, and they are modular in nature. And we'll talk more about that. An alternative is sometimes jurisdictions want to do what I would call the DIY version, which is they take a Tough Shed or a Conestoga shed, they electrify them, they offer heat, and they do that sort of on a individual basis as opposed to buying a kit that's installed by a single company. And so we wanted in our analysis to compare how these two different options held up against each other. Okay. So talking a little bit more about Pallet, this is a company that has had some significant success in offering its shelter product around essentially the United States. And so this is just some of the locations where jurisdictions have offered them. Next slide, please. And here in a little bit more depth is showing what they look like on the inside. I'll note that the picture on the left is an exemplar from their website. In the Ellensburg context, it wouldn't look exactly the same because individual folks' belongings wouldn't remain in the shelter overnight, so they probably wouldn't have a plant and pictures. But it does show the dimensions and how they are set up from a furniture perspective inside the shelter. And on the right, it shows how the pallet shelter holds up in extreme conditions like in Vermont, which is an important consideration for Ellensburg. Next slide, please. And here is another slide that just shows that pallet shelters not only offered across the United States, but it is also offered in several cities across Washington. Next slide, please. So as we were thinking through all of the costs that Ellensburg and the county would need to consider when establishing a year-round shelter, there are different buckets of costs. First, there are site preparation costs. These are individual to whatever location that you locate. It includes the ground itself. What excavation, if any, do you need to do? How do you access the utilities from the street to the site itself and into the site? What are the landscaping, lighting, and fencing costs? This is an important piece because it's not just the shelters themselves, but the area in which the shelters are located that are very important, not only for the people who are living in the shelters, but also for the adjacent neighbors and neighborhood. And so lighting and fencing and landscaping, buffering, essentially, is a key component of the cost analysis. Then there's the building infrastructure itself. So how much do the shelters themselves cost? What about bathrooms and shower units? There's some optionality in that. Staff offices, community rooms, and any other amenities that you would like to add. And we'll talk about, as we compare them, sort of what those options look like and how the costs are different. And then operating costs. So that's staffing, security, program expenses, the utilities, any lease costs, maintenance and upkeep costs, repair costs for the shelters, and all of that is generally similar with a few key differences across some of the options we'll talk through. And then finally, expansion costs. What we modeled was 25 shelter units. If you wanted less than that, obviously the cost would be less. And if over time you wanted to expand and offer more shelter space, obviously that would increase costs over time. And so what we did is we showed what if you added 2 new shelters per year for 10 years, what that cost would look like, depending on if you chose a pallet shelter option versus a tough shed option. Okay, next slide, please. So site preparation costs. This is for the recommended site, and the city public works staff and others helped provide these cost estimates. As you can see, it's approximately $400,000, a little bit under, really talking about the hardscape, the water, sewer, and electric, a pretty healthy contingency, and then some other incendiary costs. Really what we want to make sure is that as you consider a site, that you figure out all of the estimated costs. And of course, as you drill down into the actual design of what you're looking for, these costs will be updated. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the building costs, we introduced some options. So on the left, you'll see the pallet shelter cost. In the middle is a non-pallet shelter, so we'll call it the tough shed option. And then to the right is a same tough shed option, except instead of buying trailers for bathrooms and showers, instead it shows a leasing option. And so on this upfront cost, you'll see that it's quite low for the non-pallet shelter cost, you'll see a dramatic change in the operating cost because that's where the lease expense is included. And so on this slide, the shelter costs themselves is the main difference. You'll see here on the pallet side, it's 324,000, almost 325,000 for that first 25 shelters. That is much smaller for the Tough Shed and scenarios in both the lease and non-lease options. All right, next slide, please. Actually, can you go back to that previous slide? One of the things I want to say is the upfront costs here for the pallet shelter are significant, but what we'll see is there are some built-in advantages to that cost, right? So the modularity of the pallet shelter option. So a wall gets busted, a window gets busted, or some other component in the pallet shelter fails, you can pop out that side, order a replacement, and put it back in. With the Tough Shed, obviously, it's a single thing, and so repairs and maintenance are much more complicated and costly. And then also another key piece of the pallet shelter is the warranty, which obviously you would not have if you were doing it yourself. Okay, and so now with the operating costs, so you'll see that staffing and security, that remains the same across all the options because we have a singular operating model that we've modeled. However, what you'll notice is in this non-pallet shelter, we've inserted an estimate for ongoing maintenance. What we've heard from peer cities is that the DIY method is fraught with some difficulties, and they're finding that they're having much more maintenance costs that aren't covered by warranty because there's not a warranty because they did it themselves. And so this number we think is actually conservative, but we needed to have a placeholder to show the difference between a pallet shelter option versus a non-pallet shelter option. And then here you'll see in the lease option, this is where the lease payments for the bathroom trailers and shower trailers and office show up. And so because of the kind of lease costs here and the extra maintenance costs associated with both of these options, the operating expenses for the non-pallet options are more expensive. And I guess one other thing I'd like to offer is that because in the proposed agreement that you'll be considering later this evening, the city is providing site infrastructure improvements. There are no lease costs. So essentially it's a trade. You all will be making, if you approve it, infrastructure costs improvements to the site and in exchange for free rent. Okay, next slide, please. And then finally, this slide just shows that if you wanted to expand over time the number of pallet shelters or non-pallet shelters offered on site, the differential in cost for addition, and this is intuitive because the shelters for pallet are more expensive in the upfront cost, but it doesn't consider the ongoing operating and maintenance and repair costs of the Tough Shed option. I think that then is my last slide, and I am happy to answer any questions you all might have.
Council, do you have questions?
You want to go? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Candace. Thank you, Mackenzie, for the information that Eco Northwest put together. Forgive me, I'm going to ask some very generic and basic questions for the sake of all the participants that are in the room here that are probably interested in a lot of the details to the background associated with the study, since it has happened over a certain long amount of time. So forgive me, council, interrupt me if you need to pop in a question here. You mentioned the other site locations that were considered, and I understand that there were probably another top two. Could you provide or tell us about those locations and what were the eliminating factors for those sites compared to where you landed on Pathway?
So I will also defer to Heidi and Terry if they want to chime in, but I think that the main deciding factor was availability. And some of the other sites had other pros and cons about them. One was in a primarily residential area, and another had significant site infrastructure needs. But I would like to defer to Heidi to see if she has other thoughts she'd like to offer on that.
I think Cadence captured the essence of it. The one that was within the residential area was of primary concern. There would also be probably some similar significant infrastructure costs associated with that site. The other site was in a commercial district, and there was no sewer availability to it in the area. It would have to have been extended by the city to that area, along with some other similar infrastructure costs.
Can I just follow up? Were those that was just on the market generally to be leased? Were they ever contacted?
One owner was contacted, but it never went beyond contact, and I don't think the other one was contacted. It's been a site that's been up for a little while for sale. Lease. Thank you. And we did not contact them.
Councilmember Palmer, you have more?
Yeah, I got a lot more. if That's all
Go.
right. All right. So just for the sake of conversation, I'd like to know, do we have a current estimate on the amount of homeless that are currently in Ellensburg? And if so, approximate demographics, men, women, and children?
If you give me a second, that's in the report in the regular meeting. I have the statistics, but I don't have them.
Okay.
I do have them. So in the most recent, the point in time count, which was back in January, the statistics for that, the county included 35 persons living in emergency shelters, and that's a variety. That's not just the cold weather shelter. There are other shelters as well, and 13 unsheltered persons. I don't have off the top of my head how many were children. There were some, but it wasn't, I've got to say, it's not a large amount of children that were included in that, I don't believe.
Do you have any idea as far as the amount of women?
I don't have that. I know that there are representatives from Hope Source here, and perhaps in the regular session, I think they have those numbers.
Okay. As I understand it right now, the current shelters operate in a rotating amount, right? Correct? I'm wondering, of those current shelters that we currently use, that KVMA is using, this is going to come up as part of the conversation. So I would like to know how many of them are within, say, 1,000 feet of a local school or daycare as it stands today. Any idea?
I don't think Cadence is going to know that, so I'll yeah.
Sorry, I was deferring to you, Terry.
That's perfectly fine. I don't have the exact number. I know that there are representatives of KVM, the Ministerial Association, here again for later, but I know there's at least 2 or 3 that are within 1,000 feet of the school, maybe more. I know that there are some in proximity to daycare centers as well, and some have coexisted within the church with their own preschools and daycare facilities.
All right. I'm gonna let somebody else step in for a second, and I'll come back to the rest of my questions.
We did receive a letter that cited at least one daycare within one of the churches that provides shelter. And I think Ellensburg School District has moved its I can't remember what they called it, but it was at the Methodist Church, and they were a cold weather shelter for several years, coexisting with that school. And moving had nothing to do with that. They're totally changing the program. So does anyone else have questions?
We have a daycare center within a block of our church, a Methodist church right now. How
have more
specific
questions?
can we ask? I mean, I'm interested in knowing what kind of that cost that you provided for the fencing around the facility, what kind of fencing are you recommending?
Mackenzie.
I believe we modeled just a chain link fence around the four sides of the property.
Chain link?
Yes.
So if council wanted, a wooden fence similar to what you see around most of the housing developments in our town, can you give me an estimate of how much more that would cost?
I can't give you an exact estimate, but I don't think it would be that much more expensive.
Yeah, and also as I noted earlier, the contingency that staff prepared for the site preparation costs was quite healthy. And so in that $394,000 site prep cost, it probably could be accommodated depending on how quickly you all moved forward with construction.
Right, thank you.
Josh, do you have questions?
Yeah, this one just on understanding the what went into the numbers. I saw the assumption of a 3% cost increase for inflation. We haven't seen 3% for 3 to 4 years now, and we're adding $1 trillion in new debt every 100 days. To me, I think we need a higher assumption. I think it's going to be too low because we have too much money moving around the economy right now. If you go to McDonald's and it's $20, that's greater than 3%. Gas, rent. So that number, I think, is just too low. And I'd love to understand kind of where you got that assumption from, and if there's a way to justify 3%.
Yeah, obviously it's hard to predict going forward what inflation rates will be, but that is the typical number that we use based on backward looking inflation rates over the past 10 years or so. Obviously with COVID, there's been a lot of variance, but pre-COVID 2017, 2018, 2019, that was around what we were looking at. So that's the number that we use typically in our analysis.
So then the assumption would be that we're going back to where we were versus kind of crossing the Rubicon we did with COVID and the trillions and trillions of dollars that are out there. Is it because of that change in our economy, can we rely on numbers before COVID versus going forward? And is it possible to get numbers that are adjusted, probably closer to a 4.5% to 5% minimum? And even that's probably still low when you look at consumer costs.
We could go back and examine the cost inflation, and if you all would like us to use a different inflation factor, we can consider that for sure. And the good news is, though we don't have a crystal ball, you do have optionality in how much you expand or whether you expand going forward.
Another question would be on starting with 25 shelters. What would be the scenario when you get to open time at, was it 6:30, I think? And we've got too many people. Is it just first come, first serve, and then they're just kind of left on the street going backwards? Now, I know we can't house everybody. I guess, what would that scenario look like?
As you contract for operations, you would have standard operating procedures where you would figure out what to do in that scenario, right? So different jurisdictions make different decisions. Sometimes it's always first come, first serve, and it's, if you don't have if you're too late and they're all full, then that's kind of too bad. Sometimes jurisdictions have other options like hotel vouchers or other offerings. But I think what you all would have to do is figure out what you would want to do in that situation. And for sure, you'd want to mark how many days that situation arises, because then that could help you make a determination if in the following budget cycle, or if you had additional funds in the current budget cycle, whether you wanted to add additional units.
Okay, so to be determined, basically. Good. Another question I have is just on overall safety in the neighborhood. Obviously, we've got a daycare center 250 feet away. They open, my understanding, at 7:30 in the morning, and at 8 AM, we could have a couple of dozen individuals with theoretically no place to go exiting at the same time. How could we ensure the safety of our kids?
Well, there's a lot of assumptions built into that question. And so I guess I will reiterate that you would have standard operating procedures about what exiting the shelter looked like. And then over time, you would figure out where folks go. Right now, I understand many go to the library, some go to other parts of the city in order to have places to be during the day. And if services were offered on site, maybe they would be getting access to other opportunities.
You come back to Delano?
Sure, round two, if you're ready. Terry, this might be more of a question for you. During our normal operation for the sleep centers, if we exceed our capacity, do you have a fallback plan for those residents that are unable to be at sleep centers?
I'm not the expert on the sleep center, but in the years that I've been aware of it, I don't think it's ever exceeded capacity. I'm getting a head nod from Pastor Luton there, so in agreement. So I don't think that's occurred.
The property that Eco Northwest evaluated, is it under the assumption that spacing would allow for 25, or is that property that you identify would be for significantly more than that or less than that? What was kind of the scale of possible expansion on that property?
So I might also defer to Terry on this one. We identified it in our initial search, but the site select recommendation was made by the city, and yes, we're confident that 25 will fit, and then whether more can fit or not, we would need to investigate further.
Okay. As far as an assumption, again, just for the sake of folks in here in the room, if an MOU is approved, what is the overall time scale associated with from MOU to implementation conservatively that you think that 25 of these dwellings would be established?
That's an excellent question. And I think I will also defer to Terry and Heidi on that. Obviously there are multiple steps. You would want to enter into a lease agreement. You would need to figure out all of the site preparation costs or site preparation design. And then depending on the option you chose, if you chose pallet shelter, it could happen much more quickly because they're a full service operation. But then I would assume there would be some funding considerations you all would need to work out as well.
Yeah, just to supplement what Caden's covered a lot of it, but the next step, if that were approved later tonight, would be to move forward with lease negotiations and at the same time look at how to fund a sleep center. Assuming both of those move forward, then there would be an RFP, a request for proposals from potential operators that would go out. That would involve discussions ahead of time with staff, with the local community as to what does the operation look like, what do we want to require of the operator. And then there's obviously just the construction time needed. There'll be some the infrastructure improvements. They're not going to be they won't take inordinately long, but there does have to be utilities brought in, and then site preparation itself, grading and leveling the site. It has to go through the permit process. So you're talking about the SEPA review process. It's bordered on the east side by Wilson Creek, so there'll be a critical areas analysis, and the permit process can take a while. The idea I should say, ideally it would be stood up in time for the next shelter season, which would begin in mid-November. There's no way to say at this time whether we could meet that deadline, but that would be the goal.
Thank you. So kind of dovetailing off of that a little bit, this is just for the sake of planning here. With any plan, there's usually off-ramps. Off-ramps being those points of decisions that were like, okay, this is not going the way that we wanted. what is a detour path? We need to get off of this. This is not the direction. I think you identified a couple of them, but if you or Eco Northwest could kind of identify some of the off-ramps that you could foresee from MOU to implementation that are things that citizens might be concerned about, whether that's budget, whether that's cost, whether it's the CPLO review, those kinds of things.
I think, and Heidi, can we end this, but I think you just identified the major ones. I mean, budget will be a big one, obviously. The review process, it's a little bit uncertain how long that would take. There are timelines, but we have to go through that process as well. And then just getting an operational model finalized and in place for the RFP that we would put out for that. I'm sorry, does that answer your question?
It does. It does. Assuming that we establish the lease for this, obviously the city would kick in for that lease agreement with Hope Source would be the entity that would be going to, correct?
Well, we would put out an RFP, so anybody could put in for the operational
All right.
contract.
Those, and it might be a little bit too early for that, but the funds that would be used for this, does that deter in any way those funds that could be used for residents that are already close to the poverty level to help them from becoming below the poverty level? Let me rephrase that question. Give me a second.
Yeah.
I need to. So, obviously the investment into this, helps out those that are already homeless. The funds, a portion of the funds or all funds that could be used for this, could they not also be used for residents that are near the poverty level that are struggling with inflation and those kinds of things?
So there are a number of options for funding, and we're in the process of researching those. We do have the city's affordable housing sales tax as a potential option for some of the site development costs. Currently, those dollars are invested in affordable housing projects, and when you use those dollars, there's a requirement for 60%. AMI, so it's going to those most in need. There is some flexibility to that funding that would allow for a rental assistance program and things like that. We don't have a policy for that at this point, so it is one of the trade-offs that would be evaluated as we look to fund the entire facility. And again, we look to the county for some partnership. They have access to some funds that the city does not.
The state has some funding coming available
That's
as well, right?
Correct. Yes.
We can apply for
So,
either.
Councilmember Locust.
Nancy,
The
I
mayor would
just-
like to have.
before we
Richard,
stop, I've had my hand up for a little while. I just want to make sure I get a chance to say a couple
not
things.
looking at you.
It doesn't have to be right now.
Go ahead.
So I guess I kind of wanted we're having sort of a potentially divergent conversation. I mean, we're very clearly talking about site selection and, whether the other two sites, we want to revisit that process and take a look at that. Whether or not we want to look at mitigation for the potential impacts of the shelter as it is. I get that. And let's set that aside because I'm also hearing from the consultant's presentation that this is also about form. And, I go back to, when the city had a very indirect and very peripheral role in, supporting people who were underhoused or homeless. And those programs have changed significantly, with the, really significant success of all of the programs, the Ministerial Association, Hope Sources programs. I mean, and I'm missing a whole bunch of people, so not intentionally. But the problem is morphing. And what this comes down to is we have a Supreme Court decision that says, if you want to regulate camping in public facilities, this is the trade-off. And I mean, there may be other reasons why council members or community members are supporting, a different approach, this sort of option, for people who don't have a place to go. And I get that and I applaud that. But I mean, we have to make these, there's 3 or 4 decisions here. There's what role do we want the city to play? What's our funding stream going to be? How, what's that line? in terms of, what percentage of the programs do we focus on this specific issue? Because there are obviously other issues in the community. And, there's probably a baseline that we have to be at, but there isn't a top end, and we're going to have to make these decisions. And we're sort of having this conversation all mixed together, tonight. And I'd almost like to see this kind of broken down into, what's the depth of the problem? What are the trend lines telling us? Where are they going? How does this fit in with the other programs? Is this intended to be something where, hopefully you can, grab people who are at a point where they're interested in, taking advantage of some different programs so that they kind of change that trajectory? Is this a long-term sort of semi-permanent solution? What form do we want it? Where do we want it? And what are we going to do when and or if it fills up? And I guess I'll stop there because I'm throwing a lot back at the council, but I just have two specific questions about the presentation. And this is maybe for Terry. So if the capacity of the center does not absorb the need on any given day, does that negate our ability to control camping in public places? I mean, if we exceed it one day, does our rules related to public camping go out the door? That's the first question.
It would impact it because as the law stands now, if there's not sufficient shelter space for unsheltered persons, you cannot prevent them from camping in public spaces, which is obviously how this whole conversation got started.
Can I
And
ask that as an,
is that a transient decision? I mean, is that only occurs when you're not full, or does that basically undo all of the progress you made to that point?
No, it doesn't undo all the progress. It's just for those if you have 20 beds and you have 22 people and you can't accommodate them through those two people through some other method, then for that night, for those two people, there's a problem enforcing our camping restrictions.
Okay, and then I'll ask a question, and my ignorance is going to show through here on this. Some of the correspondence that we've received, and we've received a fair amount, some in favor, some against, majority against at this point, the current site specific location. And a number of those people who commented indicated there is a currently live legislation that or still potentially can pass that would potentially eliminate this as a site. Is that an accurate representation, or where are we with that?
That bill is no longer active, and it applied by definition to homeless encampments.
Got it. Okay. Asked and answered, and I'll be quiet for a little while.
Sarah and Nancy? You guys want to arm wrestle for the next? So, Josh, I think it's your turn.
Yes. All right. So I guess trying to stay focused on the presentation. When it came to site selection, was the Happy Feet Daycare Center a part of the decision making? And if so, what is it that shifted it from one site to this current one proposed?
Terry?
Yeah, thanks. Initially, while the two other sites that we mentioned were under consideration, I think you call it Happy Feet, but I'm sorry, Josh, were you asking specifically about Happy Feet or just the Pathways site? Was it considered?
So the question is, with this current proposed site, during the decision-making process, was the daycare center a factor in the process? And if so, why was this site selected over another one? Is it just money? Is it purely only availability? I'd love to know just that part of the process.
I think both of those were factors in terms of the site became available in the last several months through talks between Hope Source and the city. So that was a factor that certainly weighed in on it. And the location as compared to the other two was preferable. No site is going to be ideal. And we knew that going in. There's no perfect site. There's a lot of, there are a lot of sites that we looked at that they just weren't going to work. And most of them weren't available. Almost all of them weren't available. So the cost was not so much a factor in the site selection because there's probably a little bit of savings since if this is approved at this site, there's no lease payments over the years, which frees up future money. But there is the upfront infrastructure costs, although they're similar to probably at least one or both of the other sites. So I don't think that the finance was a primary consideration on it, the cost.
I guess to follow up on that, my understanding is we had another site that would have been feasible, but was determined not to be because of the cost of hooking up additional utilities and sewer. And so I'd like to know if that's the case, then what do we know the dollar amount? Because I think a lot of people would be concerned, or at least want to know what was the dollar amount that shifted it to a site that's so close to the daycare center.
I don't know the cost off the top of my head. It was a site that was also on I would say an entryway into the city, which was a consideration as well. It was a much smaller site, that one, considerably smaller than either of these sites. That was also a consideration.
Round three.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Eco Northwest, these are for you. In the cities that you have worked with or you've experienced these dwellings established, approximately how many cities are roughly the same size as Ellensburg, 40,000 in population or a little bit less, or somewhere close to that?
That's an excellent question, and we could definitely get back to you. I do think, though, that there are multiple cities and towns that are both bigger and smaller and around the same size as Ellensburg that have them.
I would like to be able to have that information. That would be good. Also, I'd like to
Councilmember,
understand.
I'm sorry, if I could just interject. I know, for instance, Moses Lake is very similar in size in population and they stood up a sleep center, as you may know. Burlington, I'm not quite sure.
It's bigger.
Yeah, about the same. Burlington, not Vermont, Burlington, Washington, stood up a site a year or two ago.
Walla Walla.
Walla Walla, yes.
Yeah, I would like to have that just to understand how many dwellings were set up in those cities, just as a comparison to Ellensburg. I'd also like to know how long some of those locations that you have as a comparison have been established. How many dwellings did they originally start with? How many dwellings have they increased to? What has that done to the homeless population since their establishment? Are they seeing consistent occupancy? Are they seeing some vacancy? Are they able to serve the homeless population? Or are they short as far as supply, and have they expanded since the original construction? And then the last thought and consideration is for any of those dwellings in any of those cities that are comparable size to Ellensburg, what did that operation look like pre-pandemic and then during the pandemic? And how did those operational costs impact the city? It's safe to say that unfortunately, there is a probability out there that we should all consider that if there is any kind of pandemic of any type, that we would have to figure out what that would mean to the operation, and those factors should be figured into operational costs, either short or long term.
Yeah, I'll just offer that one of the benefits of a non-congregate, so the pallet shelter or tough shed option actually is helping with pandemic type operations as opposed to a congregate shelter where you just have everybody sleeping in one big room. So you just by virtue of the form that you are considering, you're helping to at least insulate to some degree what happens if we have another spike.
Okay.
We have about 4 minutes and then we need to take a break and start our regular meeting.
Sure.
So any burning questions? You get
Just
got one
one
more?
final question. As far as the operational costs, you can provide this later on. As far as the climate location for some of the other locations, what was plugged in as far as operational costs specific to Ellensburg, considering that we have some pretty significant winters here, so snow removal for those units, those kinds of things. The last thing you need is someone trapped in one of those things overnight because there's a 3-foot swell of snow outside of it. That's not a comfortable position to be in, so.
Yeah, we can follow up with more specifics. I'll just offer that Hope Source provided a lot of the operating costs and assumptions, and I'm assuming they were based off their Moses Lake operation.
I'm done, I swear.
Josh, you got one more?
Nope, I'm good. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. So we will take a short break and return at 7.